because it is quantum physics which is making all those ancient claims of spirituality, God, and what have you, all those claims being rediscovered by science. Without the quantum background, without the quantum context, we would never make these scientific ideas that we can verify in the scientific laboratory with scientific theories.
Welcome to Science and Spirituality. Can you close your eyes for a moment and imagine your other senses are not functioning as well? With eyes closed, please try to answer the question. Does the world still exist even though you aren't conscious of it? If your answer is yes, how do you know? Well, there are highly respectable physicists who stretched their imagination and did their math. Believe it or not, their answer is no. They maintain that the universe, in order to exist, requires a conscious sentient being to be aware of it, and that, without an observer, it only exists as a possibility. One of these scientists is Dr. Amit Goswami, our guest today. Dr. Goswami is considered by many as a pioneer of the new science within consciousness, a new paradigm that he calls monistic idealism. This worldview agrees with ancient mystical traditions and spiritual teachings. Dr. Goswami earned his PhD from Calcutta University in 1964 in theoretical nuclear physics. He has been a professor of physics and a member of the Institute of Theoretical Science at the University of Oregon, USA, since 1968. He is the author of 12 books, including a well-regarded university textbook on quantum mechanics and a series of popular physics and spirituality works, including God is Not Dead and his latest, Creative Evolution. Dr. Goswami has also gained recognition by appearing in the popular 2004 documentary, What the Bleep Do We Know?, where he was interviewed for his scientific expertise. Dr. Goswami began his interview with Supreme Master Television by explaining how he became interested in consciousness and its connection to quantum physics.
It sort of came like an enlightenment. I'll tell you the whole story. I was a very dedicated nuclear physicist and certainly a materialist, namely that I believed that everything is made of matter. It was clear to me that I was not doing what physicists are supposed to do, which is relevant to our lives, relevant to how we are. So I looked for problems, relevant problems, and eventually I came to quantum measurement problems. Which is the idea that quantum physics suggests that objects are waves of possibility, but when you observe them, they do become particles of actuality.
So what is actually meaning of quantum physics for us?
That is precisely the point that I finally understood. I was always told that the quantum measurement problem is unnecessary to think about. I was concerned because obviously our consciousness must be involved. Since it is our looking that is making the change from possibility into actuality, von Neumann actually suggested that we must have a non-material connection somewhere, and that connection could be consciousness. So if you take this seriously, quantum physics looks at objects as waves of possibility for consciousness to choose from. Then you see that there is a paradox from the material way of looking at things, because there you get into the aspect that we are all possibility, both the observer and the object, and possibility coupled to possibility cannot give you actuality. Consciousness is posited to be non-material and therefore not subject to quantum physics, but how does a non-material object interact with a material object without a mediation? If you assume any kind of mediation, that mediation will have to be a signal carrying energy, and then you get in trouble with the law of energy conservation, the fact that the energy of the physical world alone is always a constant. So you get paradoxes both ways. So my question then was, what is our consciousness? There must be something about our consciousness that we are not understanding. I realized that if we posit that consciousness is the ground of all being, including matter, matter exists as wave of possibility of this consciousness itself, then we don't suffer from dualism, because consciousness is just choosing one of the facets of its own possibility. It's not a separate object from consciousness, and therefore we don't have to deal with how does an interaction take place, because it's a signal-less, interaction-less communication. In quantum physics, this is called non-locality. So in this way, I was able to bypass the difficulties that von Neumann faced.
This was the birth of the new science within consciousness. We will be right back to explore more about it. You're watching Science and Spirituality on Supreme Master Television. Welcome back to Science and Spirituality. Dr. Goswami has just explained the idea of non-local consciousness, which he believes is the ground of all being. This concept, used in physics, sounds very much like it has its roots in Eastern spirituality and philosophy. It helped him to bypass the major difficulties in understanding the quantum measurement problem.
In order to see something, we have to actually receive some light. So it is not surprising that if we send anything that changes the energy or wave function, we basically affect the object by looking at it. But not everyone thinks that consciousness does that.
If we think of ourselves as matter, then our interaction with the object will still only produce waves of possibility. Von Neumann proved it as a mathematical theorem. So if we are just pure matter and we are looking at other pure matter, then our interaction with them will only produce bigger and bigger possibility waves, but never an actual event, never an experience in which a subject looks at an object. This is the key thing to understand. How does that subject-object split of the world of possibilities took place? Materialists don't think about these things, but this is, of course, the ultimate important question. Where does our experience of subjectivity come from? How can it originate from an objective world? That comes to because consciousness is the ground of being. So when you put that into the equation, you also include the brain in the mechanism of quantum measurement.
But you mean some universal consciousness?
But it is universal consciousness. This is where scientists have nothing to worry about. The tendency is to jump into the conclusion that we are putting subjectivity into physics. How can physics be subject to the whims of individual subjects? It's not like that. The subject is universal. It's cosmic. It's unitive, and therefore completely objective. And the choice by the subject, therefore, is also completely objective.
So if I see things around me, I'm not a subject, but I'm a tool of the subject, like a camera for the subject?
The subject is universal. Then what has happened in this particular vehicle of that universal consciousness, of which I make a representation, that through quantum measurements of events that happened to me previously, I have memories of those events, and then a forgetfulness develops in us. We forget that we are the objective, unitive consciousness. Instead, we start beginning to identify ourselves with our memories. At that point, we call ourselves individual egos. And that causes a further problem. We are acting like computers with memories, and sometimes we behave like that. Our true identity is always that unitive, universal consciousness with complete freedom of choice. And since this connection always exists, there is a way to get back to that connection. This is what spirituality is all about. Spiritual practice is to remind us and reconnect us. And when that reconnection happens, then we are free once again. We are free in the sense of our choice is totally independent of our past memories and past thinking.
What kind of evidence you see in quantum mechanics that consciousness really plays that role as you describe? What actually makes that separation? Why I don't feel that you are the same as me.
We can proceed two ways. And one way, of course, is well known. What spiritual traditions do is that they work on us directly. By direct experience, we go into subtler and subtler states of consciousness, and then we fall occasionally into states of consciousness that goes by various names. In Christianity, it's called the Holy Spirit consciousness. In Sanskrit, it's called Samadhi. In Japan, it's called Satori.
And why they don't see in a casual situation?
Because of the memories, because of the patterns of habit with which you identify. The patterns of habit tells us constantly that no, you are an individual. This is all you can choose, your individual previously experienced thoughts. But coming back to this question of how do we know that, quantum physics gives us another hint. It says that, okay, this individual identity, when that has developed, this ego, is certainly local. It's very much identified with a particular brain. But if there is non-locality behind this identity, then that non-locality should be experimentally feasible to show. It was suggested originally by Einstein, Podolsky, and Rosen. But Aspe did the actual experiment where he showed that if two photons interact, they originate in the same place, that is, they interact, they become correlated, quantum entanglement, in such a way that even when they separate, even they are at a distance, they have that non-local communication at a distance, instantly, without any signals. What Hakuba's experiment did was to carry forth this same experiment for macroscopic subjects, subjects with brain, observers. So two subjects meditate together, hoping that meditation will produce the kind of correlation that quantum physics is talking about, with the intention that they will have non-local communication. After the 20 minutes, they are separated and put in what is called Faraday chambers, electromagnetically impervious chambers.
Separate them from outside interaction.
That's right. Yeah. Both subjects' brains are now connected to individual electroencephalogram machines, EEG. And now, the crucial part of the experiment, one subject and only one subject is shown a series of light flashes producing electrical activity in the occipital area of the brain, and that is measured by the EEG attached to the brain. What is very interesting in this experiment, you get from the second subject's EEG machine during the same period of the experiment, the signal that you extract is so similar in phase and strength, especially the phase part is the most interesting, that the experimenters felt compelled to call it a transferred potential. And when they use control subjects, people who don't meditate or cannot hold the intention of non-local communication, they don't show any transferred potential. So indeed, meditation has the same effect as space correlation, quantum correlation. And consciousness is that interconnectivity between the two people, now proven for macroscopic objects.
But actually Einstein didn't believe in that, and that was an argument against quantum physics. And if I remember, Niels Bohr and his Copenhagen group responded very quickly I think in a way similar as you responding, that basically spatial separation does not remove that those two objects are still one entity. That's right.
He was trying to stay within the concept of space-time, and therefore Einstein's problem. In space-time, everything must proceed through signals taking a finite amount of time. Because their speed is limited by the speed of light.
But genius of Einstein was to ask the right question.
And genius of Einstein was the right question and eventually suggest the right experiment to prove the specialness of quantum physics. Because it is quantum physics which is making all those ancient claims of spirituality, God, and what have you, all those claims being rediscovered by science. Without the quantum background, without the quantum context, we would never make these scientific ideas that we can verify in the scientific laboratory with scientific theories.
So let me recap, if I follow your way of thinking. The only way that you can understand quantum physics and how it brings that subject-object experience is by existence of the consciousness.
Yes. Consciousness is as the ground of being.
So both object, subject, and that communication is all arriving from consciousness.
Arriving from the connection, interconnectivity of the world that we call consciousness. Consciousness is an objective interconnectivity. It's not necessary to call consciousness in or visualize it in some anthropomorphic localized way. It's non-local from the get-go.
Is science capable of proving the reality of the transcendent dimension of life and God at the same time? Would science better serve the spiritual potential of humanity through a paradigm shift that puts the transcendental consciousness first as the ground of all being? Join us next Monday to find some of the answers to these questions in our conversations with Professor Amit Goswami here on Science and Spirituality on Supreme Master Television. And now, please stay tuned for Words of Wisdom right after Noteworthy News. May you be interconnected with the divine. We'll see you next time.